For the left, especially in the United States, Sweden is still regarded as somewhat of a social democratic utopia. A country that has solved many of its social ills through taxing the rich and implementing broad welfare reforms. An equal society where the hand of the state has been visible enough to rein in the market. Is this a true image? Let me give you the academic answer. It both is and it isn't. In fact, Sweden now ranks number 10 on the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, well ahead of countries that we perceive to be much more economically liberal, such as the US, for example, in place 25, or the UK in place 28. While it is true that Sweden's cradle-to-grave welfare system remains, it is also a country where market-oriented reforms has fundamentally changed the functioning of the economy in the last 40 years. And in this talk, I will try to explain why. And here is my main argument. In the 1970s, the Social Democrats went too far in their ambition to curb capitalism in Sweden. The pushback from Swedish business and the center-right parties, fueled by the market-oriented ideas of the 1980s and the collapse of the rigid state-centered world economic order of the Bretton Woods era, led to a fundamentally different society than the one that Bernie Sanders thinks that we live in. So, what are the historical reasons behind the rise of deregulation, competition, and individual choice in a country so long characterized by social democracy? I think we can begin this story in 1932, when the Social Democrats, for the first time, managed to form a majority government together with the Farmers' Party. The party, the Social Democrats, would then stay in power for an incredible 44 years. And by the early 1930s, the party had gotten rid of most of its Marxist legacy, but it was still, not so surprising, in favor of increased state control over the economy. And an ambitious Keynesian-styled demand management program was put in place to get Sweden out of the Great Depression. In Sweden, as elsewhere in Europe, the political left was on the rise in the aftermath of World War II. Nationalization of certain key industries was one of the proposals that would increase inequality and spread wealth to the many. Both France and the UK saw nationalization of certain public utilities, industries, and in the French case, also banks. A similar debate raged in Sweden, and on the slide here you see a campaign poster from the Social Democrats in 1946 that reads, "The good of the people before the good of big business." The response from industry captains was to launch a massive campaign for free enterprise. Inspired to a large extent by Friedrich Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, the idea was that an increased statal planning of the economy would eventually lead to a totalitarian dictatorship. This fierce debate ended, as is so often in the case in Sweden, with a compromise. The Social Democrats managed to stay in power, but decided to better their relations with big business, thus laying the ground for a corporatist social order, where organized interests played an important role in the preparation and implementation of public policies. As political scientist Peter Katzenstein has argued, for a small country like Sweden, the reliance on exports and access to world markets put pressures on both unions and employers alike to promote rationalization and technological change. The aim became to secure a liberal international economic order based on free trade and multilateralism. Specialization and economies of scale in export rather than domestic markets led to a higher degree of openness to trade than it often does in larger countries. The fascination for Swedish pragmatism and peaceful relations between labor and capital also gained attraction abroad. And on the slide here, you'll see the US Secretary of Labor in the Kennedy administration, Arthur Goldberg, playing boccia with the Swedish Prime Minister Tage Erlander and labor and business leaders in a symbolic picture from the era. The British Labour leader Harold Wilson also toyed with the idea to do as his Swedish colleague did, of inviting the interest organizations to his country home Chequers for talks and negotiations. What also brought business and labor together in Sweden was, of course, the notion of a common enemy in the East. In case of war with the Soviet Union, everyone needed to be prepared and to work together. This is actually not produced by AI, this picture. With the political radicalization of the late 1960s, what was already known then as the Swedish model came under pressure. Inspired by American economist J.K. Galbraith and others, there were new calls both from outside and within the labor movement to spread the affluence to the many. The political and social democracy was already in place. It was now time for the third step, economic democracy. And this was achieved through a rapid growth of the public sector, financed by higher taxes and labor market reforms that strengthened the unions. The debate on nationalizations also came back. The most radical proposal, however, came from the Swedish Trade Union Confederation and its chief economist Rudolf Meidner, shown in the slide here. As a Marxist from a young age and growing up in a Jewish family, Meidner had fled from Germany in 1933 and settled in Sweden, making a fast career as an economist in the labor movement. Meidner had a vision of a new type of society that will solve the old Marxist problem of ownership over capital in the hands of the few. But he did see the problems that we just heard Sergei talk about the inefficiencies and major bureaucracy and lack of political freedom in the East. So his solution was rather that it was not the state that should own the capital, but it was the unions that should be the dynamo in the economy. And in 1975, he presented his idea, wage earner funds. These, as they were called in Swedish, löntagarfonder, would gain ownership over the big firms by having the firms transfer parts of their profits, not in cash, but in their own stock, to union-controlled funds. And depending on the size of these transfers and the size of profits, the unions would, after a number of years, run big business. And this would, according to Meidner, lead to more sharing of corporate profits, a less skewed distribution of wealth and ownership, obviously, and also compensate workers in Sweden's successful exporting firms for having held back in earlier wage agreements. The proposal led to a decade-long political debate that culminated with the largest protest in the history of Stockholm on the 4th of October 1983, when some 75,000 people took to the streets organized by the Swedish Employers' Confederation. The Prime Minister at the time, Olof Palme, called it the most comprehensive political scaremongering campaign our country has ever seen. The demonstrations continued all through the 1980s, creating what the organizers labeled as an anti-socialistic movement, broadening the message to include lower taxes, more freedom of choice, and better conditions for business. The funds were eventually implemented in 1984, but in a much watered-down form. And in contrast to the Marxist-inspired Meidner, the social democratic leadership realized the many problems with the funds. And as the finance minister, Kjell-Olof Feldt, put it in what is probably the most famous poem in Swedish history, during a very long and tedious debate about the funds in the Swedish parliament, he wrote, and it was not meant for the public eye, but it was caught by accident on camera by a press photographer. He wrote in Swedish, "Löntagarfonder är ett jävla skit, men har vi baxat dem ända hit." Which in English reads sort of like, wage earner funds are a damn load of shit, but look how far we've shoveled it. In the end, the party scrapped the compulsory transfer of shares and imposed a maximum 8% limit of fund ownership in private companies. The funds got their assets from a new profit tax and an increase of the pension fee. 5 wage earner funds, located in different regions, bought shares like any other institutional investor, eventually becoming the 8th largest owner on the stock exchange. They were, however, still controlled by the unions and chaired by high-ranking social democrats. But their communication was that of a partner to business and a stable financier, not a group of revolutionaries coming to take over the companies. They also functioned to a lesser extent as venture capitalists by lending money for equity in smaller and local firms. A campaign for the funds in 1983 by the Social Democrats illustrates how the funds, in their words, were typically Swedish, i.e. a result of compromise, and that they would, not as other investors at the time, move their decisions to New York. With money pouring into the asset markets in the early 1980s, following the abandonment of the Bretton Woods system's strict rule for capital transfers and deregulation of credit markets, the timing was good. But the stock-heavy wage earner funds did not fare well in Sweden's financial meltdown of the early 1990s. And upon dismantlement in 1993, it turned out that they had performed somewhat below comparable indices. And I think this can be attributed to 3 causes. 1, unions are good at many things, but professional asset management is not one of them. Number 2, the difficulty incorporating with the Swedish business community, which was extremely skeptical of the wage earner funds, mainly for ideological reasons. And 3, the funds were only allowed to take long positions in Swedish stocks, thus shutting them from spreading the risks on other assets or in other countries, and they were not allowed to hedge position by using derivatives, a financial instrument that was becoming increasingly popular in the 1980s. As it turned out, the whole wage earner funds idea was a relic of the Fordist era, where workers stayed with one employer for a lifetime and industrial profits were high and seemed to be eternal. In the rapidly changing world of the 1980s, characterized by computer-driven technology, as we just heard, round-the-clock financial trading, and declining support for socialism worldwide, the semi-Marxist idea of löntagarfonder belonged to the past, not the future. For the business community and for the centre-right parties, the funds were a legacy of the Social Democrats having gone too far and an ill-masked attempt of socialization. In 1991, a centre-right government led by Bildt came to power. Its very first decision was to dismantle the funds. In the new government's eyes, the funds were the first and foremost symbol of the attempt to socialize Sweden and should therefore be buried forever. Although the wave of deregulation had started already in the 1980s when the Social Democrats liberalized the credit market, the Bildt government initiated what was called a freedom of choice revolution that aimed at opening up the country's sclerotic public sector to tax-financed private competition. Old public monopolies fell, including the markets for aviation, taxi, postal services, railways, TV, radio, education, energy, and primarily and elderly care. The pros and cons of these regulations have been much debated since, especially the publicly funded school voucher system, inspired by Chicago economist Milton Friedman. Governments from both sides of the political aisle have since continued the path of liberalizing the economy, including also to lower taxes. Sweden now, and this might be interesting to know, has no inheritance tax, no wealth tax, and in practice very low taxes on capital gains and property. Taxes on income, however, are still among the highest in the world, and over lunch we can debate why that is the case. The 20 billion Swedish krona that the wage earner funds had under management was by the new government transferred to research foundations, to 2 state universities turned into private foundations, and not without historical irony, to 2 new privatized venture capital firms that supplied entrepreneurs in the deregulated welfare sector with capital. Indeed, the new type of society that Meidner had envisioned did materialize, but not in the way that he had imagined. Here is not the time, since I have about a minute to go, to discuss the many implications of Sweden's sharp market turn, but we can conclude that the market indeed has prevailed in Sweden. According to a recent book by the German historian Reinhold Sittemann, Swedes are very positive to the market economy, ending up in place 7 of 32 studied countries. In another study, Sittemann concludes that the Swedes are the only people who oppose extra high taxes on the rich, also highly unusual. In the most recent International Property Rights Index, Sweden came in 7th place out of 125 countries. So, to conclude, is Sweden the promised land of Bernie Sanders or of Milton Friedman? Strangely enough, it is both, and I hope that this 15-minute high-speed lectures of the political economy of Sweden has illustrated, at least in part, how that came about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rikard. I mean, one criticism of the idea of the planned economy is that it doesn't take sort of unintended consequences into account. And that seems to go for campaigning for the planned economy as well, because Rudolf Meidner, when he suggested the wage earner funds, he did more for free market thinking than almost anybody in Swedish history has done. And you have described the sort of success of the free market counter-revolution. Maybe it's too strong a word, but still. How permanent do you think it'll be? I sense an increasing support for state activism in the economy in quite a number of fields these days.
Yeah. No, I think a lot of us do. But this is the good thing of being a historian. You don't need to predict the future. But no, I think you're right. I think the pendulum is for many reasons. Also, it has to do with all of these security reasons and the rise of protectionism generally in the worldwide. The pendulum is swinging the other way back. But I don't think it will go all the way as it did in the 1970s. No.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.